Good morning. We have a good number out this morning. Very glad to see each and every one of you out. It's funny what you see sometimes when you stand up and look. And some have already known that I'm going to preach this morning because Kevin's grandson is just out of it. Boy, I mean, he's just completely gone. So he already knows I'm going to be preaching. So you just get distracted sometimes when you get up here. Turn in your Bibles, if you would, to the book of Mark. Mark chapter 8. We're going to be studying from this particular chapter this morning. And as you go there, we need to kind of set the context. We kind of need to know what's going on for us to kind of, get a good feel for what we're going to study this morning. And Jesus is now and has been in the area of Galilee. Actually, he had been over in the area of Tyre and Sidon, where he had healed the Phoenician's daughter at the time. But then he had come back to the area of Galilee now. And here in the area of Galilee, people, obviously by this time, his name has spread among all the people. And they know exactly what he's capable of. They know that he can do things that no one else could ever do. That he could heal them of their infirmities. He healed those who were lame and those who were crippled. He could take those who couldn't hear and he could allow them to hear now. Those who couldn't speak, they could speak. All these different infirmities that they had, he could heal them of it. And so people were coming from everywhere just so that they could get close to him, just so that they could have the chance of being able to get close to him and touch him and then be healed of the things that have caused him so much problems. And so a great crowd had gathered there. Many, many people had gathered. And they had been with him for 3 days now. It says here in Mark chapter 8, they had been with him for 3 days and they had no food. Now, exactly what that means by no food, I'll let, that just kind of dwell on you for a little bit. But they were to the point where they didn't have enough to eat, so that these people who had come from far away, Jesus said, I have compassion on them, because since they have come from a long distance, they will faint on their way home if I send them away. So he says, let's give them something to eat. And his disciples said, where are we to find something to give them in such a desolate place? How are we supposed to give them bread to eat here out in the middle of nowhere, as we might say? How many loaves do you have? And the disciples start looking to see what kind of food that they have, and they have 7. And so he takes the bread, and he blesses the bread. And they say, we also have a few small fish. So he takes the fish, and he divides it up, and he starts handing it out to the disciples, and they start handing it out to the people, and all the people keep receiving food, and it just keeps coming, and it keeps coming, and it keeps coming. And they were all able to eat and be satisfied. So much so that they were able, after they were all able to eat and be full, satisfied. And by the way, when you have teenage boys and boys that like I have, you think, boy, they had a lot, because it takes a lot to satisfy them. And they were all ate and they were satisfied, and they started collecting all the leftovers. And there were 7 baskets. Now, just so that you understand, this word for basket in the Greek, which I don't know Greek, but the people who do, say that this particular word means it's not just a little small basket that you might take on a small picnic for yourself. These are big, huge, large baskets. 7 baskets full left over. I was like, wow, how could they have that? They didn't start out with that much. Well, that's kind of the point, isn't it? Jesus showed them that even though they didn't have much, they had him, and that was enough, wasn't it? And so he's able then to, now that they have food, he's able to send the crowd away. And he gets in the boat with his, well, not yet. Well, yeah, he does. He gets in the boat with his disciples, it says in verse 11. In verse 10, he gets in the boat with his disciples. They went to the district of Dalmanutha. And on the other side, when they get to the other side, they come in contact now with some Pharisees. And these Pharisees come up to Jesus and they start arguing with him. They're just trying to accuse him. They're trying to get him to do something so that way they can test him and try him and accuse him of something. And so they ask him, they say, give us a sign. We need a sign from you. Well, now that's an interesting thing, that all the other people around knew exactly what Jesus could do and came to him in order to be healed. And yet these people, these Pharisees, demand of him a sign. In Matthew's account of this, Jesus said, isn't it interesting that you come and ask for a sign? When you can read the signs of the heavens, you can see that in the morning, if it's red in the morning, sailors warn. If you can see in the morning that it's going to be bad weather if it's red. But if it's in the evening, you can say, well, we're going to have fair weather. You can read the weather, but you can't read the signs that I have been given you. all these things that Jesus had already done for them. Over in the book of John, John chapter 5, Jesus had taught to them there, and he taught to them about the authority that he had been given, and why he was acting the way that he was, and why he was teaching the things that he was teaching, and why he was doing the things that he was doing. And he was basically telling them, I have the authority because I come from God and I am God. And he said, if you don't believe anything else in John 5 and verse 36, believe on account of the works that I do. They're evident. You can see that I am not like everyone else. And yet they come demanding again another sign. See, the problem was, and we'll talk more about this as we go through, the problem was that they couldn't see the signs. The problem is they didn't want to see the signs. They refused to see. But they come demanding a sign, and Jesus said, there will be no sign given to you. And again, in Matthew's account, he goes a little bit further, saying, except the sign of Jonah, which is that Jesus would be raised from the dead. He said, there'll be no other sign given to you. I'm not just going to be doing it at your whim, right? Well, he left the Pharisees. And having left the Pharisees, he gets with his disciples into the boat again. And when he gets into the boat, he's obviously contemplating what has just happened with these Pharisees. And so he gives his disciples a warning. He says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod, or the Herodians. Beware. Well, now the disciples, who I have a lot of sympathy for because I feel like I would be nowhere any close to any better than they were sitting there thinking, wow, we only brought one loaf of bread for all of us. He's saying, why didn't you bring enough to eat? Jesus understood what they were thinking. He knew what they were thinking. And he says to them, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? They said 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? They said to him, 7. And he said to them, do you not yet understand? Why would he be asking them about bringing enough food when he obviously could supply the food? He was not talking to them about physical food. They began to understand what he was talking about. Beware of the teaching and the doctrine and the actions of those who were Pharisees, of the Sadducees. Those who were religious but yet were not allowing God's commands to sink in and to change them. Beware of that, he said. Now, keeping all that in mind, now they come to the area of Bethsaida. And when they come here, the people, now this particular Bethsaida, according to most scholars, is not the same Bethsaida as the ones where Andrew and Peter were from, but a different one, but in the same general area. And so they bring to him a man who was blind. And they begged Jesus to heal the man. Now, again, when you start thinking and studying it's really interesting some of the details that they give us. It says there that Jesus took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. Now I want you to think, many years from now, as this is happening here, many years from now, that man's going to look back and said, Jesus grabbed me by the hand and led me out. He obviously had compassion for him. He didn't want him to trip and fall, but he also didn't want to do what they asked him to do right there in the middle of all the people. We kind of learn a little bit later on that he is seeking some privacy to be with his disciples, and so he's not really wanting to gather up another huge crowd, but he has compassion for this blind man. So he leads him out of the village. And then he spits and takes the spit and he lays it on the blind man. Now, saliva, spit, was thought to have some healing purposes. And if the man was blind, it may be that he had something around his eyes. You know, you can speculate a lot of different things, but whatever the case is, Jesus chose to use spit. And so he takes the spit and he puts it on the blind man, and then he asks him a question. He says, do you see anything? The man answers, he says, I see men, but they looked like trees walking. Now, a couple of things. Number one, this man obviously had not been blind since birth because he knew what trees looked like. I see men, but they look like trees, and they're walking. He couldn't see clearly, right? And the older you get, the more you understand that, because it's really easy not to see clearly. He says, I just can't see clearly. So it says, then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again. And he opened his eyes, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And then Jesus sent him away, told him not to even go into the village, not to go even to the town, but to go home. He saw everything clearly. This is a very interesting miracle. The only one that I'm aware of, that I can think of at least, and please correct me later if I'm wrong, and I'll make that correction up here. It's the only one that I can think of where he did it in stages like this. You know, typically we think about his miracles and we say that we knew that they were miracles because they were instantaneous, right? Boom, it was done. They didn't have to wait years or months. But in this particular case, Jesus did it in stages. Do you see anything? Well, I see men, they look like trees though. And then he touched them again. He says, now I can see clearly. It's kind of like when you go to the eye doctor and they're, is this better or this better? Is this better or this better, right? Well, now I can see clearly. Why? Why did it happen this way? Well, I can tell you some reasons why it didn't happen this way. It's not because Jesus didn't have the power to do it instantaneously. He showed that he did, right? He showed his power over all these maladies, all these sicknesses. He could heal anything. He could raise people from the dead. He had power over nature. He had all power. So it wasn't because Jesus didn't have the power to heal him instantly. We know that for a fact. So that wasn't it. So what was it? Why would he do it this way? Well, that's a great question. And the Bible doesn't tell us specifically why. But I think as we look back at what we've just talked about what's been going on, maybe it gives us an indication of why Jesus did it this way. If we just look at the recent events, the feeding of the 4,000, the Pharisees who sought a sign, and the disciples misunderstanding his warning, could it be that Jesus used this as an opportunity to teach the disciples that sometimes our spiritual vision, our spiritual understanding isn't quite as clear as it should be? And that it's sometimes maybe we need a second touch. I think it's true that there are times when we don't see things as clearly as we ought to. That there are times when we're, for lack of a better way of saying it, we're spiritually blind. And there are a lot of things that can cause us to be spiritually blind. When you start thinking about it, tradition is one thing that can cause us to be spiritually blind. You know, the Jews, God's special people, given a special revelation by his great servant Moses, they had been given the law of Moses, and yet they had a problem over and over again in their history of having problems with tradition, raising their own tradition above God's law. If you look back one chapter in Mark chapter 7, the Pharisees had come together and they had come to Jesus again, and they start questioning him. They start asking, why do your disciples, why do they eat with defiled, that is unwashed hands? Not according to our tradition. They had all these kinds of traditions, specific ceremonies about how you're supposed to wash your hands before eating, when you come back from the market and all these rules, right? And I'm a rule person, but they had a lot of rules, right? And they said, why do your disciples not follow our rules? Why do they not follow our traditions? And Jesus says, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. This is in Mark 7 and verse 6. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrine the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men. And he said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. And he goes on to give the example of where God's law says, honor your father and mother, but they made a tradition of their own that says, well, but if what we have, we call it a gift to God, Corban, then we don't have to do that anymore. And they held their own tradition above God's law. Their tradition blinded them. Their traditions blinded them. Matter of fact, one of the reasons why they kept wanting to kill Jesus was because their view of the Sabbath and their breaking of the Sabbath. It was because Jesus was breaking their traditional view of it, what they defined, and not what it really was. Tradition is something that caused them to be blinded. Is it possible that people today can be blinded by tradition? Well, if we look out in the denominational world, we would say that that's true. We can't understand why some of those folks can't see that you're following your creeds, you're not following what God's will says. You know, following your own creeds is basically following your own traditions, your own rules. And we say, why can't they see that? And the answer simply is because they've gotten used to following their traditions. But we need to be very careful before we start throwing too many stones. We need to make sure that we understand what we do and why we do them. And we don't follow them just because Dad said so, or just because Mom did it that way, or just because the elders have done it that way forever. And no, we've always done it that way. Why? Traditions are things that can blind us. There's nothing wrong with good traditions as long as they're in agreement with God's law. So we need to be careful that we don't allow tradition to spiritually blind us at times. We can also allow, which is kind of associated with tradition, ignorance. Ignorance to blind us. Ignorance is simply, we think of it as a bad word, but it's not really. It just means you don't know. But there's a reason. The question is, why do you not know? So again, the Jews, the Israelites, were given God's special revelation through Moses, and yet even though they had the law, and they had even a special group of people who were used to teach them the law, they often were spiritually ignorant. We all remember Hosea chapter 4 and verse 6. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I reject you from being a priest to me. They were ignorant of God's law for them. But we shouldn't be too hard on them as compared to other people, because really even we have walked in ignorance. If you look in the book of Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 17, Paul says, now this I say and testify in the Lord, that you must no longer walk as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their minds. They are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, due to their hardness of heart. They have become callous and have given themselves up to sensuality, greedy to practice every kind of impurity. You know, in reality, before we committed ourselves to God, and even sometimes after, if we're not careful, we are ignorant willfully. You see, ignorance sometimes can be not knowing because no one's taught you. You don't understand yet, and then ignorance can also be at times a chosen path. It's a willful decision that you remain ignorant. And often it's because of our desire to do what we want to do. So if we don't know the rules, if we don't know what He wants us, then we'll just claim ignorance, right? We say that all the time at work and other places, right? Well, I'll just claim ignorance. I'll go ahead and do it and claim ignorance. Maybe, the old joke, forgiveness is easier than permission when it comes to those kinds of things. Well, when it comes to spirituality, we shouldn't think that way at all. Ignorance can be something that blinds us. We should be more like those who were the Bereans, not wanting to be ignorant, but searching the Scriptures. How it is I lose this all the time, I don't know. It's a short little area. You'd think I wouldn't lose it, right? Tradition, ignorance, and then one more, fear. One of the common reasons why people rejected Jesus in the first century, the Jews rejected Jesus in the first century, was because they were afraid. They were afraid to admit that He was the Christ, that He was the Messiah, that He was the Son of God. And quite honestly, their fears were not unfounded. It wasn't an irrational fear, because what they were scared of was a couple of things. Number one, they were scared that they would be socially outcast, ostracized from the Jewish culture, the Jewish nation. In other words, they would be told, you can't come into the synagogue. You're no longer part of our group anymore. And there was a reason why they were afraid of it, is because they were told that they would be socially outcast. You remember the other blind man that Jesus, one of the other blind men that Jesus healed in John chapter 9, a man who had been blind from birth? And he rubbed on his eyes as well and sent him to the pool of Siloam to be washed. And when he did that, he could see, but he didn't see Jesus because Jesus wasn't with him. Well, he did it on the Sabbath day. And so the Pharisees brought him in and said, well, who healed you? And asked him all sorts of questions. And they weren't satisfied with his answers, so they called his parents in and said, is this your son? How can he see now? Well, we know this is our son. We know that he was born blind. But now how he can see, we don't know. He's old enough, you ask him. You know why they said that? It says there that they were afraid that they would be cast out of the synagogue because they had been told that they would be. Even later on in Jesus' life, in John chapter 12, and down around verses 42 and 43, in the last week of his life, even some of the rulers there believed in Jesus, but they were afraid to announce it because they wanted the glory of men more than the glory of God. They were afraid of being socially outcast. But they were also afraid of being persecuted, physically persecuted. Jesus warned them, warned his disciples that they would have to make a choice, that there was going to come a time when they would be persecuted, and even persecuted by people who thought they were doing the right things. You remember Saul of Tarsus? You're going to be persecuted, so you need to count the cost. And some people counted it and said, I'm not going to pay it. I'm not going to pay it. Fear. What about us? Does tradition, ignorance, fear, are those things that can cause us to be blinded today? Does fear blind us from seeing God's commands clearly? Do we fail to follow them because we fear social exclusion? We need to be careful and think about it. Do I spread God's truth to others, or do I fail to do so because I fear of being disliked, labeled a radical, religious nut? Do I stand up for righteous behavior and what's right? Or do I cave in because I don't want to be considered different? Fear. It's a real thing. But we have to look at what it cost us to not obey. So if these are some of the things that can cause us to be spiritually blinded or keep us from seeing clearly, what is it that we need? Well, we need a second touch. You remember what it said? Do you see anything? I see men walking around like trees. And he touched him again. And he opened his eyes and he could see clearly. One of the things that this passage seems to teach me is that Jesus is patient. See, I think he was trying to show to his disciples that he's patient with them. Because remember, he had just asked them, when he had talked to them about the bread, he says, do you not see? Do you not perceive? Do you not yet understand? They had been with him through all this, and yet they couldn't see clearly. This man couldn't see clearly, so he touched him again. He was patient. How is it that Jesus will be patient with us? How is it that Jesus will provide us this second touch? What do we need to do in order to receive this second touch? Well, one of the first things we need to do is have a receptive heart. An open and receptive heart. You know, we can't go through this life arrogant. We talked about this some yesterday. That the only person God can't do anything with is the proud person. He just can't. Because he won't rely upon God. He won't submit to God. We must be people who will open up our hearts. Unfortunately, many of the religious Jews in the time of Jesus, they were too arrogant too prideful to open up their hearts to Him, and so therefore they were blind. At the end of John chapter 9, the passage that we just mentioned just a minute ago when we were talking about the man who was born blind and then him asking the parents, at the very end of that, Jesus appears to the man. He comes to the man after he had been cast out by the Jews. And then after having showed Himself to him and telling him it is He that provided the miracle for him, in verse 39, Jesus says, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees that were around said, "Are we also blind?" Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say, 'We see,' your guilt remains." They relied too heavily upon their own self-righteousness and said, "We see," and yet they didn't. We have to be open in our hearts, willing to be taught. And then we also need to have determined minds. Once we have a heart that says, "I need something," we need to have a determination to go and find the help that we need. There are many examples of this in the New Testament of people who wanted to find Jesus. Now, they had specific requests, but it still gives us the same idea of the kind of determination that we need. You remember the woman who had the issue with blood for 12 years and had spent all of her money, everything that she had, and as Jesus was on His way to heal Jairus' daughter, she said, "If I can just find a way to touch Him, just to be next to Him and touch Him, I know that I can be healed," and she did. She touched Him and she was healed immediately. There's a lot more in that story that we could talk about, but it was just her determination that I wanted to talk about. Her determination to get close to God, to get close to Jesus. We also, if we want to have spiritual clarity, we're going to have an open heart, and we're going to have a determined mind. But how will Jesus supply that then? How is it that He will provide us with this spiritual clarity? Well, He's going to do a few things. Number one, He always provides us with His Word. It's always available to us. Do we understand the blessing that we have? That at any point in time, we can open up His words for us? It's there. We have, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 2 and verse 16, we have the mind of Christ available to us. You want to know how bad sin is? You listen? You want to know how bad sin is? Read. It's right there. You want to know what sin will do to your life? Right there it is. It's right here. You want to know how much God loves you such that He was able to take away that sin through His Son's blood? It's right here. You want to know? It's right here. You want to know what you need to do to please God? It's right here. You know what you've got to have? An open heart and a determined mind to find it. We've got His Word. We also have His blood. In 1 John chapter 1, and beginning in verse 7, "But if we walk in the light as He is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus His Son cleanses us from all sin. If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. If we confess our sins, He is faithful and just to forgive us our sins, and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness." Folks, I know who I am. I'm a person who sins way too often, allowing my own lust and my own desires to allow me to think things and do things that I shouldn't. I know who I am. And I am so very grateful that God is who He is. That Christ's blood is available when I turn back. And He can help us see clearly if we'll turn back. Jesus' blood is there. His Word, His blood, and also through His servants. It's an impressive thing to me over in the book of Acts chapter 18, when Apollos, an eloquent speaker and one who was mighty in the Scriptures, that is the law of Moses, he was speaking, but he only knew about Jesus up to the point of the baptism of John. That's all he knew. He thought he knew. He thought he was clear, but yet he wasn't clear yet. He didn't have the clarity that he needed. And you know who took him aside? Aquila and Priscilla, God's servants. You see, if we're really looking to find God's will for us. He'll provide it to us in His Word. He provides it to us through His blood, and then there are times when He sends us somebody in our lives to help us to see it in our lives as well, through His servants. There are many Aquila and Priscillas out there that can help us and will help us. Why did Jesus heal him in stages? This could be one of the reasons why. It helps us to understand that there are times that we don't see clearly yet, but if we'll get that second touch, we can see clearly now. I thank you for your attention this morning. I appreciate it very much. If you're here this morning, you've never obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ, we'd ask you, we'd urge you, we'd beg you to do so while you have time and opportunity. Maybe you've done that and there's something in your life that's not right, and you need the help of the brethren here. We'd love to pray with you. We'd love to help you in any way that we can. We'd ask you to come while we stand and while we sing.